The act of redressing refers to the remedy and correction of an undesirable or unfair situation.
A redress movement refers to the efforts made by individuals to gain justice, recognition, and compensation for systematic atrocities committed against them.
It is this type of movement that advocates for governmental action to be taken so that reconciliation and healing can be written into law.
This can manifest itself in the form of an apology, social reforms, or financial compensation.
Advocates of redress movements are committed to holding governments accountable for their wrongdoings in a way that ensures that no one else will ever have to suffer a similar fate.
As such, the world has seen various instances of redress occur with the intent to rectify varied cases of racial discrimination.
Japanese Americans pioneered their redress movement in the aftermath of the Second World War. This came as a result of the awful conditions they were subjected to as a consequence of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. By 1942, President Roosevelt signed Order 9066, which led way to over 120,000 Japanese Americans being imprisoned on the United States West Coast in 10 relocation camps across 7 states. The first known challenger of this systemic cruelty was Minoru Yasui, who on March 28, 1942, entered a Portland police department demanding to be arrested because he refused to obey the curfews imposed upon him. Yasui, who was a lawyer himself, ended up spending a year in prison. Upon finishing his sentence, Yasui would go on to make his case to the Supreme Court. Although he lost the case, Yasui's defiance was not in vain because the majority of Americans would go on to view Roosevelt's decision as a tragedy. 40 years after the war ended, Ronald Reagan, who opposed redress legislation for most of his political career, reversed his position after Japanese Americans and their allies in Congress successfully built a strong case in its favor. On August 10, 1988, Reagan signed the redress legislation into law and gave a brief apology to Japanese Americans. Individuals who were incarcerated as a consequence of Executive Order 9066 were eligible to receive $20,000. This isn't to suggest that Ronald Reagan was a great man by any means, but rather it was a testament to the resilience and dedication of the Japanese American people. Among the influential groups involved in making this victory possible was the Japanese American Citizens League. The organization was founded in 1929 with the goals of promoting Japanese integration into American culture and advocating for the civil rights of Japanese Americans. Since its inception, the JACL has expanded its mission, and in its current form, the JACL advocates for the rights of all Asian Americans, while maintaining its primary focus on Japanese American affairs. It is also important to note that the JACL's history is nuanced, and Asian Americans within and outside the League have had contradicting views at times. Thus, it cannot be considered representative of the Asian community in totality. In fact, many have criticized the JACL for its compliance with the U.S. government. And while it isn't a perfect representation of redress as a whole, the JACL played a critical role in lobbying for the 1988 Civil Liberties Act.
Of course, redress is not confined to the happenings of Japanese Americans. As there is no singular redress movement, their origins are varied in both racial diversification and their place of occurrence. In the case of Canada, in addition to their Japanese population, redress was also pursued by the Chinese. Chinese Canadians had sought to redress the racially motivated actions of the government via acknowledgement and monetary compensation. Immigrants were initially drawn in by seemingly lucrative, high-fatality opportunities laboring for the Canadian Railroad. Then, from 1885 to 1923, Chinese immigrants were required to pay for their admission into Canada. Initially starting at $10 per person, the price of this head tax slowly escalated to $500, accurately reflecting the government's growing displeasure with the volume of incoming Chinese. From the 81,000 Chinese immigrants, the government would accumulate a total of $23 million. At today's rate, this would be the equivalent of jumping from $1,700 per person to $18,000, with profits totaling $292 million. But despite the increase in the admission fee, lack of voting rights, and the subsequent segregation and second-class treatment, Chinese immigrants continued to cross the ocean, all in hopes of striking it rich at the promised land that many would refer to as Gold Mountain. Then, in 1923, Canada had passed legislation that entirely cut off the flow of Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Immigration Act resulted in the prolonged separation of families who had not yet consolidated on Canadian soil. Roughly 2 decades later, following the conclusion of World War II, Chinese Canadians had amassed enough influence to pursue racial equality. The Chinese Immigration Act was dissolved in 1947, allowing for the Chinese to immigrate without a head tax. However, no compensation was offered to the generations of immigrants who paid exorbitantly for their racially motivated admission fees. By 1983, thousands of surviving head taxpayers, their families, and communities had begun their pursuit for compensation, thus sparking their respective redress movement. Unfortunately, nothing resembling substantial compensation or acknowledgement would occur until 2006. Stephen Harper issued a formal apology on behalf of the Canadian government and issued $20,000 to head tax survivors or their surviving spouses. But given the 80 years that had passed since the conclusion of the head tax, of the 81,000 who paid, there were only 785 remaining individuals eligible to make their claims. The government has allocated a few $1,000,000 in the way of historical preservation and associated projects in acknowledgement of the head tax, but ultimately the delayed response and subsequent savings would leave affected families dissatisfied.
Much has been said about the history of redress movements, as well as their accomplishments.
And organized efforts towards indemnification also exist to represent other wronged peoples across the world. African Americans, Muslims, and various indigenous peoples are but a few of those who have been victimized under racially motivated contexts.
For the parties responsible for these injustices, it is easier to forget about the past. But for those who remember and those who need to remember, their battles have yet to conclude.
The pursuit for redress remains an ongoing battle littered with deaf ears and averted eyes.
So for those of you who wish to contribute to redress efforts in favor of a more equitable world, we would like to encourage you to check out the various links we have provided for further reading and involvement.
The path towards healing is both long and daunting.
But even then, the journey continues.